gentleman from Texas. It's another adjournment resolution. Members can come and go as they wish. But I'm going to keep the hearing going. Gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Listening to a lot of the testimony, I kind of had deja vu all over again. I was invited to the White House. It doesn't happen often in my case to hear the President unveil his capital markets reform plan. And I was struck by the fact that I could have given 80% of the President's speech, and I agree with about 20% of his legislation. So as I listen to the testimony here, I find myself in agreement with the overwhelming majority of the testimony, but when I look at the underlying legislation, H.R. 1705, the Durbin Companion Bill in the Senate, there just seems to be a big disconnect. Number one, I want to agree with most of the panel. Consumer disclosure is broken. I think there's a fairly unanimous opinion about that. Now, there's a debate as to the causes. And I believe there's certainly merit in the idea of gaining better expertise about consumer marketing, consumer understanding. Even happy to propose that in a new agency. But as I read H.R. 1705, I see something that goes way beyond simply empowering a consumer with more effective disclosure. I mean, what I see is an unelected body granted the legal authority to ban from the marketplace any consumer financial product, practice, or feature it considers quote-unquote unfair, quote-unquote anti-consumer. And then in Section 10 of the bill, both civil and criminal penalties may apply to officers, directors, employees of firms that produce products that are judged quote-unquote unfair or quote-unquote anti-consumer. I mean, this just strikes me as incredibly draconian and a disconnect from the testimony that I hear. So my first question is, first, can I safely assume that all are familiar with Mr. Delahunt's bill, H.R. 1705? If you're not, could you raise your hand? Seeing no hands, I assume people have familiarity with the bill.
It depends on what you mean by familiarity. I'm somebody who gives out pop quizzes, and I can say right now, I don't want to take a pop quiz on that.
Okay,
bill
well, Professor Warren, if you were here for Congressman Delahunt's testimony, he gave you credit for being the mother of the idea. Have you abandoned your child?
I do not want to be cross-examined on a particular provision. I'm saying I didn't read it before I came in here this morning.
Fair enough. Since the others seem to have familiarity. For those who are familiar with the bill, do you support it? Mr. Pollack?
I think you're absolutely right, Congressman, and I don't.
Okay. Do you support the legislation?
The consumer group strongly support it, Mr.
Okay, thank you.
And I just want to say quickly that it's not just consumer disclosure that's broken, it's consumer protection that's broken.
Forgive me, I have a short amount of time. Ms. Seidman, do you support the legislation?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
And I also
let me ask this question then, if I could, for those particularly who support the legislation. I want to talk about a few financial products and ask if you believe they are unfair, anti-consumer. And if you would raise your hand if you believe they're unfair, anti-consumer. If you don't believe it or you don't have opinion, you can leave your hand down. Negative amortization arms. Does anybody believe those are unfair, anti-consumer? Okay, we've got a couple of hands there. Subprime mortgages, the entire universe of subprime mortgages.
I can't understand this without seeing what the paperwork is that accompanies them and what the disclosure is that's given to the consumer.
That's fine, Professor. So again, I guess you're saying some you would support, some you wouldn't. ATM fees, does anybody believe they are per se unfair or anti-consumer? We have one hand
there. A $30 fee for a $5 overdraft is unfair.
I'm asking for your opinion. Non-interest bearing checking accounts. Does anybody believe they are unfair, anti-consumer? Unfortunately, my time is waning, but again, among this body of ostensibly studied people, very intelligent people, people who know a lot about this subject, clearly the terms unfair and anti-consumer are most subjective. And now people are advocating legislation to turn over this incredible power to these people to potentially ban products. I mean, there's no grandfathering that I can find in this clause. Under my reading of this, then, does anybody believe that this panel would not have the legal authority, for example, to ban ATM fees? Has anybody interpreted the bill otherwise? Mr. Yingling, if the panel banned ATM fees, would we have fewer ATM machines available to consumers, in your opinion?
Well, you'd have almost none in airports and places like that.
Okay.
I would say you don't need to get there. You have unfair and deceptive practices. This committee passed a bill last Congress to spread that over all the regulators. And if you look at the way the Fed interpreted that in the credit card area, the authority's there. You don't need this new vague, open-ended authority.
The gentleman from California.